Hi, and welcome to the 6th class of syn101 here at FXPHG. That's kind of a tongue twister. I'm John Montgomery, serving as always as the voice for Victor Wolanski. Today we're going to be working with a shot that honestly is not one of the prettiest shots in the world, but it really does introduce a lot of issues for us to deal with. And you know, when you're doing tracking and so forth, it's just kind of like it's about what you do when you run into problem shots. And Victor used this in a previous PF track class and kind of wanted to show a different way of doing that here in Synthesize than what was done in PF track. And so we're going to use this compressed DV footage. And as Victor says, welcome to your first Synthesize Nightmare class. And if we load it in, you can see that it is effectively interlaced. We'll zoom in here, and you see just a lot of compression artifacts as well that happen. They're just nature of the case, or part of the beast in working with video. And we also, of course, have field information that we need to get rid of because you're not going to be able to track that without getting rid of the fields and so forth. So go ahead and edit the shot, and we'll go ahead and switch here to starting even. That's just normally what we do. And now if you step through, you can see that it actually jumps backwards as we go through frame to frame. And the fields are going the other way. So we're going to go ahead and correct that by editing the shot and saying starting odd and hit OK. And now we've got our shot laid out correctly, where we've got individual kind of clean frame in essence for every field. And you can see that we've got, you know, well over double the length of frames that we started with, because again, it's assigning a single field to each frame for our purposes and tracking purposes here. So you end up getting a little more jagged edges and so forth. Things kind of shake up and down within the shot because of the field motion and so forth. So you get a little bit more jitter than you might ordinarily in clean frames. And you can see maybe a little bit ghosting between frames. And the compression obviously becomes quite visible when you're looking at it as well. But again, this is the way that you want to end up tracking the interlaced footage, and this is the same way that Victor did this for the PF track class as well if you wanted to. Again, there's, you know, you could de-interlace this in another application, whatever. There are always a lot of different ways to approach a shot when you're dealing with stuff, and this is just one way. Now, normally he'd go ahead and run the auto tracker and delete the trackers that you don't want to use. We talked about that and showed that in previous classes, but we really needed to approach using masks in the application. So we're going to use masking capabilities along with manual tracking to drive that mask. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and switch over to the manual tracker tab. And we've done this a lot before in the past, so go ahead and hit the new track. But we're going to select this here. We haven't done this yet, and it's really useful. We're going to have it set a key of 8 and a key smooth of 4. What this will do is this will actually end up setting and redefining the tracker point, refreshing the content of the tracker every 8 frames, so that as your object changes and rotates and changes over, modifies over time, it will set a new keyframe 8 frames. And each time you do that, you can have the possibility of introducing a little bit of jitter or so forth into that, a bit of a jump into that. And that's what the key smooth value is used for. So we'll get this set up here, and we'll see what I mean once we go ahead and set this moving across in space, because we know this is changing a lot because of all the artifacts. So go ahead and go forward here, and you can see that it's adding a keyframe every 8 frames for us, and it's by doing this, it's actually able to maintain a lock much more easily than you would ordinarily by tracking the belt buckle there on our hero, Mr. Seymour, who's carrying around the yellow Pelican case. And then once it moves off frame, we can see that at frame 440, it actually doesn't track anymore. And again, very effective use for us in kind of manually updating it. So we'll go ahead and lock that so we don't have to worry about getting that tracked or changed or modifying anymore. And the next thing we're going to want to do is go ahead and draw our mask. So you select this little crazy little guy icon here in the mask panel. You can see that we've got a camera and a spline effectively selected on every single frame that you do. Even if you don't use it, there's going to be a spline and a camera every single time. It's an inclusive mask for the camera, and it tells where to kill the trackers as they exit off of frame. Okay, so that's what this is used for. You don't want to actually delete that or get rid of that. If you remember the PF track class, Victor would do this actually as a manual purpose in PF track to kill trackers as they went off screen, but it's on by default within SynthEyes. So to create a mask, it's really straightforward. We're going to go ahead and include a favorite tool. And the first click that you make in this screen is going to be the place that's the pivot point for your mask, the center of rotation, if you would, in this 2D image. So go ahead and click here on the tracker because that's going to be where we're going to do it. The next thing we do is click, and you end up start drawing the spline. Now, when you click, you can click twice to swap between a spline-based drawing for your keyframes or a linear base. So if you click twice, it'll switch to linear. Click twice again, the next point you'll drive will be a spline. The next one will be go ahead and be linear, and so forth and so on. So you can really interactively, as you're drawing them, swap easily between the two by using the double click functionality. And then this is a gotcha for a lot of us. If you go ahead and right click, you'll close the path, and if you double click on the point, we'll switch those points over to linear. So just change those first couple points that were drawn and switch them over to linear between them. The next step that we want to do is we want to go ahead and get the tracking information and have that applied over to the mask. So we've already set up our tracker to do that. What we're going to do is go ahead, and it can be kind of problematic because if you take that point here and then we'll go ahead and import tracker and select it, you're going to see that we're going to actually lock that point to the tracker. Now that can be actually pretty useful because you can actually have a shape or something like that. You can actually track points in your mask, which can actually be really incredibly useful in a lot of different purposes. But in this case, that's not what we want to do. But again, what we want to do, we'll go ahead and undo that. What we want to do is go ahead and apply that transform to the entire spline as opposed to just a single point on the spline. So what we're going to do is go ahead and select import tracker to CP, select the whole spline, and do it. And by doing that, that locks it over to the tracking point as opposed to just an individual point. And then we'll go ahead and turn that off. And you can see now that our shape is tracked to the track that we did on the belt buckle. So now what we have to do is go ahead and adjust the spline over time so that we have the person who's walking through this frame, we have Mike, that does not influence or we don't have any tracking points inside the mask. Again, the idea of what we're doing here is creating a mask to say that we don't want to have any tracking points inside this mask. Again, just one way of approaching this solution. Again, as you've seen in the past, you can actually sometimes really easily delete the points manually if you want. But it's a fairly long clip, and so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go through and finesse this and stop the recording and come back when we have the entire spline completed. So here we have the mask, and you can see it's not perfect, but again, we have most of the masking done. But you can see we've got this set up so that we have it mic'd, rotoscoped out so that the trackers won't track anything within this area. Now, one thing that it's interesting to point out, and why Victor's a little bit skeptical about using a mask in this situation, and again, we'll end up with a good track doing this. But if you look here, you've got a lot of area here that could be very useful for tracking. You know, there are lots of points that we're ignoring. Also, if you take a look at the points between the legs, you could find some points on the ground that'd be kind of useful. And you could of course draw another mask there to get rid of those points if you wanted to, or allow those points if you wanted to. But it might be more problematic when you're just masking that with the legs crossing and so forth. It might have just been easier to not draw the mask. But again, this is part of the exploration that you do when examining a shot. There are times you'll try one thing, it might not work, and you're going to want to try another. So again, it's just important to know how to use these tools so you have them as part of your tracking arsenal. Now, one thing that we have to have in mind before we actually start the tracking process and start tracking this scene is to take a look at this tracker here that we added in the beginning that we used to track our mask. Because, of course, remember, this is a manual tracking point here that we put in the scene, but it's attached to a moving object. So we don't really want this tracking point to influence the solve on the scene or influence the scene. What we can do is we can turn that to a 0 weight tracker, and what will happen is the tracker will not be used as part of the solve and not used as part of the solution in getting the scene, but you will actually get this tracker as part of your scene, so you'll end up with it in the end. So it might be useful to have that position, but it's not actually going to affect the result of the solve and the robustness of your camera move, and we'll use that in later classes and talk more about that. So in this case, what we're going to do is we can just go ahead and actually delete it. And once you apply that tracking data to the mask shape and the pivot point, you'll still have that motion that's associated with the mask. So in this case, it's probably better just go ahead and delete that tracking point. So now let's go ahead and fire off the tracker. So what we're going to do probably first is, like normal, is we're going to go ahead and get our tracking points as we normally have done in the past. So go ahead and click the auto tracker. And what it'll do is we'll go out and compute the blips and so forth, as we've seen multiple times in the class. And again, it's going to ignore the area that's inside the mask where Micah is walking. And if you take a look at the scene, you can start to see that we've got some decent points that have been tracked in the scene. Obviously, some of the higher contrast points have been tracked. But we're going to go ahead and hit the solve and say go. And end up seeing what happens with our camera solution. And it's obviously not going to work right the first time, and we'll see how we can correct those and have keys of what we should be looking for in order to make and look for our scene to look better. So go ahead and zoom in on our camera path, and if you take a look at the path here, you can see right away that there's something wrong. Just in looking to move, you know that that's not happening. So we take a look at the camera. Check this out here. There's really a big distractive move, or aggressive move actually, over say 10 or 20 frames. And so there's obviously a problem of some kind within this area. And a clue of that is to take a look at your trackers and see if there's something that's wrong in your scene, something that's jumping around that's maybe having a little too much priority. And this is that tracker right there you're seeing. Actually, you can see it jump. See it jump right down there. It's an active tracker. You can tell because it's surrounded by the box, and it's helping to contribute to get bad motion. So we'll go ahead and select that, hit delete, and let's go ahead and do that again. We're not going to do it refine or anything. We're just going to go ahead and have it resolve it and click OK and check it out. That actually helped an incredible amount. One simple little thing, one simple little tracker that was removed, but it has a huge impact on the scene. So you can know that be on the lookout for that as clues in what's going wrong in your scene. Sometimes some of these big major differences are actually quite easily solvable. Now take a look at the scene. You can actually see, if you look at the graph, there's a lot of noise, a lot of jumping and so forth. You can take a look at the graph. It's a lot of high frequency in there, jumping around and so forth. And it's probably once again a case here of having individual tracking points which are messing up the solve and so forth. So if we take a look at this, maybe the leaves are moving or something like that. Maybe just because the resolution of the scene with the compression, the trackers are jumping around. So we'll go ahead, and what you want to do is go ahead and take a look at the scene full frame. Go ahead and erase the solution and take a look at our original trackers here, the blips, and you can start to see things that are kind of jumping around. So just keep an eye on the active trackers that are jumping, and one right there is a good case of it. You can kind of see it kind of shaking right around there. So we'll go ahead and select that, and we'll want to get rid of that so it doesn't contribute to making our solve bad. And that was adding a lot of noise, and there's probably still a lot of scenes to see, or a lot of trackers here that we can get rid of as well. And we'll get rid of those. So just take some time to go through the scene and find those and get rid of them. You want to keep your good ones, but this is where the human eye comes in. Yes, machines are not going to be fully able to take over 3D tracking, at least at this point. So get rid of those, and then what we're going to want to do is maybe you want to have a little more trackers on the ground that will help us give a little bit of parallax and so forth. You know, more tracking points that are closer to the camera in combination with the points back here in the background. So go ahead and delete that again. Delete that one. It's not very good. It's kind of jumping around. Maybe a little bit of a wind, or maybe a little bit of a resolution difference. Again, we've have the resolution because of deinterlacing that as well. So that can actually be problematic in your scene versus something that's got full frame-based motion. And again, there's just a lot of noise inherent in the scene from the start anyway that can trick the trackers. So that one looks pretty good there. That's not bad. But again, maybe some of those that aren't actually attached to such a white flowers, but Victor's kind of skeptical that some of those points in the background are causing that. So go ahead and try that. So we take a look at this. It seemed to help a little bit, but not a whole lot in our case. It really didn't do a great deal in helping us get a better track out of this situation. So they're still not really good at all. A lot of those points back there are probably not very good. So we'll do a combination of maybe deleting some more of those trackers as well as adding some manual points that can actually help the track. So let's go ahead and get rid of the solve and take a look. Once again, examine some of our tracking points that we might be able to get rid of here in the background scene that are maybe a bit sketchy or dodgy and are causing our camera solve to kind of choke when we actually do it. Victor's kind of, again, skeptical of some of these points back here in the back and maybe causing errors and so forth within our track. But one thing to point out here is you can always convert an auto tracker, into a manual tracker. So what we can do is go ahead and switch over to the manual track panel and unlock it. And now it's become a manual track from an auto track. So that we can do is we'll go ahead here and set our keyframe value to 8 and our key smooth to 4 to help that jump out when the key gets redefined, and hit play. And then you end up getting your tracker set up a little bit better because the manual tracker at times can have a much better algorithm for tracking. We'll also use this finalize tool that when you're set with your final tracker, what you can do is you can say kind of make an average over a couple frames. So we're going to go ahead and filter frames over 2, and basically it'll help fill in gaps and steps and so forth. And then this is how much power you put in the filter here through filter strength, and this will kind of smooth out the track for you. There's a chance that you could actually kind of smooth that out too much if you've got a jerky camera move, because maybe some of that is part of your actual move. But in this case, there's a good chance that a lot of that just has to do with the amount of noise that we have in the scene that's contributing to the tracker kind of jumping around as opposed to being clean. So do the same thing to this one. Set the key to 8 and the key smooth to 4, and we'll track forward and go ahead and hit play. And now we'll go back here and see what happened. Something happened. Must have actually maybe deleted that, or no, there it is. And after that, we'll go ahead and take that tracker and we'll set it up to be 2 in the same strength to kind of do a bit of finalizing that tracker and smoothness in it, and then go ahead and lock it back, turn it off. Now, the other thing we want to do is kind of have our eyes out for manual track points that we might be able to add, which are there. There's a really good high contrast object right there. And so that's gone, so that works for us. You know it's going to have a good track because it's got a good high contrast, so we'll go ahead and lock that. And now we're going to go ahead and add a few more trackers here as well. It's some regions that really look good to us here. You can see this object right there is really solid. It's not fluttering the wind or anything like that, and it's big enough that the noise isn't going to cause a problem for us. Go ahead and lock that off. maybe on the floor what we want to look at, because as we talked earlier, we want to have some objects that are closer to the camera. They'll help with the camera solve for that. Again, right now they're all kind of back at the same kind of z depth. They're relatively the same z depth. So let's take a look here. So there are no points on the ground at all. So what we can do is we can go ahead and actually take some of the points and actually start peeling them and turn them into trackers that are actually going to be used. So what we're going to use is use our eyes again to examine these paths and find some paths that are of decent length and that don't look noisy or a lot of roughness in the paths that are being displayed. And again, this is going to really help because we're going to try and get as many points as we can and as many z depths as we can possibly do within the scene. And anything we can do to maximize that is really going to help us get a better camera solve. Now let's take a look at a few over here. So just go ahead and get as many points as you think look good. And again, the more smooth ones, the better in helping us with our solve. And just go ahead again, just find more points, because again, the ground plane was really quite sparse in what ended up when we started doing the solve and so forth and doing the track as well. And again, you can kind of also clue in on the actual objects that they're kind of keying in, and you can kind of have a good eye of whether there's a lot of contrast and whether it's an easily trackable object that you're selecting for a peel. So let's go ahead and try and solve the shot here. And now after the solve, you can see that our path, our camera path, is looking way better. We don't have a little bit of a glitch. You can see that we've got one right there. You can see that right there, that little spike there that becomes really easily visible. So we'll need to take a look at this and see what might be causing our problem. This is where a little detective work comes in handy, because you need to kind of find one or two trackers probably on this frame that are causing us problems. And you need to find that and go ahead and delete it. But looking at that, all the tracking points looked pretty good in the scene. So the next logical conclusion for us is that it's not maybe a bad tracking point, but maybe not enough tracking points on this particular frame. So what we're going to do is want to go ahead and switch over here and start peeling a couple more tracking points on the scene, because again, we want to add a couple more in here on the solve. At this point, you can tell here that we don't have a lot of points here in our foreground. So again, find some points that are somewhat promising within this general area. Don't add too many at one time, because if you add too many at one time, you might not know which points you added that actually made your track worse than what you started out with. So the best thing to do is to go ahead and come into it, select a limited number of points and not too many, and then try and refine it before you keep adding points from the scene, because definitely done some tracks where it actually made things worse by adding too many points, or points that actually aren't appropriate in generating a final camera solve. So again, the points that we're selecting here will help us add some camera parallax and hopefully smooth over that little spike that we saw within the camera path when we were looking at it in the quad view. So what we're going to go ahead, we want to turn off peel, come back here, and we're going to switch to refine, because our track is actually pretty good at this point. Not terrible, at least. And let's go ahead and zoom in here, and we'll hit go. And hopefully, of course, it changes the position of the camera here. So we're refining. And as you can see, we're resting right around that bad area, or near that bad area, but the path is much cleaner. So instead of that being a case initially when we were looking at it maybe being some bad tracking points in the frame, it actually ended up being not enough tracking points. And if you look here at the beginning, that's kind of the same thing here. We don't see any tracking points on the ground that aren't active. because they're previous frames tracking points, because you don't have green ones on here. So what we want to do is go ahead and do the same kind of process here. Select that and start peeling off some trackers here that we want to add to help with the solution. And again, the idea, we want to get some that are close to the camera, see if there are any good tracking points that are further from the camera. You don't want to, put just points willy-nilly, so to speak. You want to make sure that there's a good Z depth and high quality tracking points if you're going to peel them, because you can really quickly actually end up masking or messing up your track. So go ahead and refine and hit go. And there you can see the path actually is even smoother overall, and it cleans out especially that first part where our camera was resting on. So what you can do is go ahead and just keep doing that process, adding some trackers, smoothing out jumpy points or noisy points in your camera path with peel and or a little bit of manual tracking. And then you can also do the finalized trackers to filter your trackers as well within the scene. It's best to kind of do that also right as you're kind of cleaning up your scene, and not one of the first steps you want to do, hence the term finalize, I guess. And if you take a look at this track here, you can see that we got a good path. Actually, even look at the camera path, it seems like that's what it's doing. It's actually especially considerably good, considering the fact that we're coming from DV footage with all the noise and compression artifacts and the interlacing. You can see we've got a nice shape of the bushes that's going on. You can see of our ground here, it's got a nice distribution of points between the camera and the bush. So again, these are all visual cues that help you decide if your track is looking pretty good. Actually, consider this as actually a decent looking track and looking pretty good. So again, this is a tricky shot. It's not something really easy. There are a lot of issues that cause problems, as we mentioned. If you get something great on the first try, you're very lucky, because it's not going to happen. This is kind of the normal thing. Anyone can hit the auto tracker and get a nice smooth shot with very clean and good full frame motion, but shot like these that really take the craft to the next level. Now here's the oriented shot that Victor has done, and we can see we put a small guy and a big guy kind of locked into the ground, and these are once again a really good way of confirming the accuracy of your track. And you can see it's actually looking really well. And again, I'd like to kind of see what kind of work you guys can do with this shot this week. I'd like to kind of see the tracks, if you can kind of create a little QuickTime movie. Tell us about some of the things that you found to help you get a better track on the scene and so forth. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, be sure to drop by the forums and ask any questions about this or anything else related to Synthesize. Well, that's it for this week. I'm John Montgomery, again, the voice of Victor Wolanski. This is Victor's class and course, of course. Once again, thanks for being a part of FX PhD, and we'll see you in the forums.